All right, here we are, Randall and Aaron,
How's it going?
Mavens of Content, podcast number one or 101. I think you're never supposed to start with one. It makes you sound like you're brand new.
That's
It's
true.
like
That's true. I
101
think my
or
first I
1001.
think my first project number was six. I just randomly went to six.
Yeah,
So
this I guess we can make this part of the intro. I am the founder and CEO of ArcVision, and in the early days, I remember when we were starting online orders and taking invoices. I think we started at like 12,368 or something, right? And so nobody ever wants to know that they're number one.
nice. I actually started with 15,006. And it's funny, as we get into talking about content, because having been in a bunch of firms over the years, I'm amazed at how different the standards are for how people organize projects. And I'm like, you need to just start with the year. I think it makes it so you can find it, when was the job started. But some people do it like in folders, and you and I have talked about this. So I was like, well,
Yeah,
my first project started in 15, so it was 1-5, and then I didn't want
yeah,
it to be number one, so it was number 006. And
yeah. Encode a little info into the name, which happens all the time.
yeah, a little bit. Not that starting with number six makes me any less new than starting with number one. I guess I should have gone with like 347. But
Yeah. Well,
anyway,
let's get this thing going.
yes.
Let's introduce yourself, and then
Uh,
I'll
yeah, I'm
go
Aaron
ahead.
Maller from Parallax. I'm in Dallas. Been working with BIM and content for about the last 10 or 11 years, and started Parallax about 9 months ago to reach out to more people in the industry and to help push things forward. So it's been a good first year.
Good. And as I said, my name is Randall Stevens. I am founder, CEO of a company called ArcVision. So most people know us in the industry for the RPC technology, which is a visualization kind of rendering, entourage rendering technology that we developed. But Aaron and I came together over the last year through an event that we has started called the Building Content Summit. That's actually what we're going to kind of make this first episode about. But in general, the goal not only of that conference but of this podcast is to talk about BIM related content and all things content related in the building industry. So, any flavor to add there, Aaron?
I think you nailed it there. BCS, the Building Content Summit. When Wes and Randall first reached out to me about the event, I remember interrupting Wes on the phone because I was currently also working on DTS for RTC. But I said, oh, if there's a content thing, I want to be involved in that because content's like our biggest issue right now. And it was kind of funny because I didn't know that's what he was calling about, was to ask if this was something I felt was important to me that I wanted to get involved in. And I was just like, shh, I'm in, I'm in.
That's good. Well,
Yeah.
I'll give you a little background on kind of how all that stuff came about and how I got involved with it. We've been developing a content management platform here at ArcVision called Avail that is about to hit the market. And it's been, I'll say, in my head for about 10 years and in earnest working on different pieces of it over the last 5 years and lots of conversations with customers out there in the AEC market about how they're managing content. And one of the things I started hearing over and over when I was talking to people like yourself inside of firms that were trying to deal with all this stuff was one thing was manufacturers' content sucks.
That's
and
very true. It's terrible. Most of it's
I,
really terrible.
I would hear it over and over. Since we're a software company, so even though we're in this space, we're not practicing. So you miss, you're always trying to kind of keep your ears close to the people that actually, are sitting and doing this stuff all day long. So, when I started hearing that, I just started asking. It's like, well, why does it suck? And have you told them? And so that I'll say is the kind of genesis of the story for how the Building Content Summit came around. I'd been involved in attending and or exhibiting at the Revit Technology Conference over the last, I think maybe all but the first year that was here in the States. And so I'd gotten to know Wes Ben and, of course, Jim Balding, who's involved with that as well. So I guess 2.5 years ago now, I approached them and just said, I've been, digging into this content side of this stuff more and more, and I keep hearing this. I said, I think there might need to be or we could argue that there could be a event that we could put together. And since those guys were already in the event business, I just ran it past them and said, looks like we really need to get manufacturers in the same room with the practitioners, and then ultimately the software and service providers, who are a lot of times the middlemen putting the tools together, and just have a frank, open conversation about this, because it is complicated, and if these people aren't if they're talking past each other, then they're not doing anybody any service. So that was at I think I did that at one of the RTC events, and then soon after that fall we were at AU together. So I was up in the hotel room with Jim and Wes and gave them the pitch again, and they said, let's give it a shot. So I ran downstairs and grabbed the first two people, went to Steve Germano, who's with InView, and said, hey, here's what we're talking about doing. Is this something you'd be interested in? He's like, you got to talk to Parley. So he said Parley's been talking about exactly the same thing and maybe wanted to put an event together. So that's how Parley got involved, and then went over and talked to Bob from Spectrum BIM, and
Bob Wygant.
Yeah, and Bob. So they were both, very encouraging of it. So that's really kind of how it all started, and it came together really quickly last summer. But we had over 100 people attended, and a good day, and we're expanding that this year to a 2-day event.
Yeah, last year's was great. I know I just got involved in it right before, I guess, 2 months before North America. My brain's foggy. Last year was DC, so you guys must have talked about it in Chicago, I'm guessing. And everybody that you just mentioned, it's interesting because it's kind of a small group of people who all go around and talk about these same issues. I mean, I first met Bob at an Autodesk event up in Waltham, and I'll never forget Bob's and my first conversation, because it was over a piece of content that I had built that we were trying out in a beta version of Revit. And while we were it's a piece of content I hold very dearly that I've used in a lot of different firms. And when Bob first opened it, he's like, this is absolute garbage. And it was a great conversation, because to him, when he first looked at it, it looked like garbage, because, Bob's very involved with building a lot of content for a lot of manufacturers. And so he has very regimented standards that, not to say I don't, his go along with the standards that are required to publish to Seek and to be considered good manufacturers content. And so it was hilarious, because we were 2 rows away in this room where everybody was semi-quiet and testing software, and we just started yelling at each other, which I thought was great.
That's actually getting you and Bob both involved last year was part of the most fun of it, because we knew if we put you two in the room together that there was just going to be sparks, I'll say, but also interesting sparks, right? You guys are both great, deep knowledge, right, of content and involved with this stuff. So it's that's part of what this event has been about, was to get people in the room talking about this. And I think what you just said, though, is one of the things that makes that event great, is that we kind of told everybody that as we started promoting it, like, this isn't a come and learn. This is come and bring your knowledge, and then be willing to listen, as much as you talk, to what other people are saying. Because I think what we found out in that room last year when we did this in DC was that I think everybody came across like really understanding a little more that it is complicated, that when people say content, that means a lot of different things to different people, and there is no like content unicorn. There is no perfect piece of content that can be created.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of my favorite parts of the conversation that we had in DC, and I did actually just teach a class on a part of this at RTC in Australia, was that we had a big discussion as a whole group with all 100 people about whether or not it makes sense to have one content standard, and is that even something that's achievable? Is our effort better spent looking at devices and tools and methods that migrate things from one standard to another? But it was a great conversation, because we weren't sitting there goofing around with like, well, let's develop a new standard. And it wasn't that kind of an event. It wasn't geared towards trying to solve the problem of everybody's content is different, so much as talking about what it would take for people to work through the problem, which I think is a much more intelligent way to have that conversation. Um, Marcus Feek, who's involved in BCS Europe, which we'll talk about a little later on the call. Marcus and I drove from Sydney up to RTC Australia in Hunter Valley for a couple of hours, and in the car, the two of us with a gentleman from who was also attending the conference, the three of us in the car were talking about differences in international standards, and once you cross the international slash terminology barrier, you realize that trying to make one standard doesn't even make sense. And I always go back to my door content. It's not called a door panel everywhere. And the moment you say that, the international standard is kind of out the window. So,
yeah. I think I think the thing for me that that came out of last year's conference was, that when people talk about content is I think most of the time they think about geometry, but there is also a lot of data that is combined with that.
Absolutely.
And I think one of the things that came out in last year's event was this realization, you may be involved in one kind of slice or phase of where a project is, and what your needs are obviously is very specific to those needs. But I think there was a kind of an appreciation that throughout these different phases, in fact, that's how we're organizing the event this year, is to kind of break up and make sure that we're talking about content along these different phases of a project, all the way from conception through facilities management and the ongoing life cycle of these buildings, and the data that you need, whether that's in the form of geometry or the metadata that's attached to that, changes and has all kinds of varied needs. So I think that was one of the important things. We did a little remember we did the graph at the beginning of the day, and that all came about. We decided to do you have one laying nearby?
It is. It's like up? I do. It's sitting right over here. God bless Mark's headphones.
So one of the, while you're grabbing that, one of the Parley Burnett, who's at InView Labs, and I were co-chairs of the conference last year, and one of the things we were talking about was kind of this understanding that there is this complication. So we ended up making a graph and saying, how would different people plot this, the importance or the fidelity, however you want to call fidelity, or what you want to refer to as fidelity, as far as geometry versus data. So I made up a quick graph, and the first thing I did was send it over. I said, let's test this on Aaron, because I bet Aaron would answer this differently than I would answer it, because I've got more of a visualization background. So Aaron's holding up the graph. So we did that as an exercise with the entire room last year, and had them all plot that out, and then we tried to compile them all by the end of the day and show everybody, just as a testament to, like, look, everybody thinks about this in different ways across these phases.
Yes, and I will have those. I do have them all, and I started compiling them. And it's amazing what interesting software that got into for compiling. But be that as it may, and comparing last year's format to this year's format is why I'm really excited about this year's event. I think last year's was great. We had some great conversations. But, as Randall said, one thing that was not missing last year, but one thing that was hard to broach was there were a few people there last year that were from facilities and building ownership stakes and whatnot, but they were not as represented among the people as, say, the folks who use the content during design. And so this year, when we were brainstorming and putting the program together, the idea got thrown out there at one of our planning sessions mid-year to actually organize it by kind of project lifecycle phase. And for each lifecycle phase, there's going to be, a perspective given by somebody who works in that time frame. So, there will be folks from construction, and there will be folks from facilities management, and there will be, folks like us who either provide or distribute or use content. So I think we'll get even more in depth into the actual problems that happen at every phase of the project, and not just, well, this reference plane's in the wrong spot, and which I think also. That also opens up an interesting thing, which is that, this is not about necessarily Revit standards for content. And I think that's a really great conversation to have. When we first started marketing BCS this year, I reached out to a lot of other folks, ArchiCAD communities, Bentley communities, EcoSim, even the SketchUp communities. And a few people, did ask, well, is this a Revit content thing, or why would we come to this?
Yeah.
And so
Well,
there's,
and I think it's, we probably caused a little bit of, or at least we don't help the confusion of that because we piggybacked on top of the Revit Technology Conference. And part of that was just, the people that were putting on that event were using their, I'll say, infrastructure to help put on this event as well. But it was also, Revit, there's no denying that Revit is a hot topic and has been getting hotter and hotter over the last few years as the adoption, at least in the U.S., has really ramped up. So, getting people as they were coming into town to go to the Revit Technology Conference to come in a day early and attend last year's event, and same this year. So we're, at some point, I think I'd like to see us move. I put a note down that's like, who in the hell decided to do an event in Phoenix and Scottsdale in July? So I joke around with Wes that I think he definitely has good taste because we always have great facilities around the world wherever these.
It's a beautiful venue. It's an absolutely beautiful venue.
It's great. It'll be temperate, so bring your swimming trunks. But
yeah, there's a few things about that I think are really interesting. I did just get back a few weeks ago from RTC Australasia, which is the RTC event that happens in Australia or New Zealand, as they call it. And most people don't know that RTC, which used to be a much longer name called the Revit Technology Conference, and now it's just called RTC. That change, even though it is still an acronym that used to stand for Revit, that change is because they're trying to bring in more of the BIM community and not just the Revit community. And a lot of people don't know that at RTC this year, ArchiCon, which is a conference for ArchiCAD, was actually happening with us at RTC. So there were RTC classes and there were ArchiCon classes, and the committee was working together. Events were happening together, the keynotes were together, the closing sessions were together, and it's part of a bigger. It's part of a bigger opportunity to bring the ArchiCAD, the EcoSim, and the Revit communities together. So, why is it happening? Is it Revit specific? I'd say absolutely not. I would say it's probably a statement of fact that we'll have a majority of Revit users versus other users. And a lot of that is just because it's tough to convince users of other platforms that coming to an event being hosted by a group called RTC is still not a Revit specific event.
Yeah, I think it brings up a good point though about with BCS about bringing the manufacturers into the room. And
Absolutely.
One of the things that I was kind of keen on last summer was, while you hear people bitch and gripe about what's being produced by the manufacturers,
Mm-hmm.
some of what I think people need to understand is if you put their hat on, you're looking at, okay, I'm being asked to produce content. Well, for which platform? So, we had Ken Nasotka from Victaulic, who's a manufacturer involved last year. And Ken was running a team. I think they were producing content for 28 different software platforms. So,
Mm-hmm.
That's part of the challenge, too, that everybody has to understand is, people are trying to run businesses. Are you going to just pick one and focus on it to the detriment of all the others?
Right,
Or,
right.
Can you create some kind of content that can easily be converted or used across? So there's all those challenges. There's
the cat.
What's the cat's name?
That's the office cat called Marble.
Marble.
He'll walk across the screen in a minute. He always does. And not to cut you off with cat distractions, but that was one of the great conversations that came out of last year is when manufacturers say, well, yeah, we're asked to build it in 28 platforms. That kind of brings up what I kind of see as the point of BCS, and that is, as much as this would put somebody like me potentially out of business, why does a whole industry exist where people have to take 28 platforms and make versions of real building products? I don't like to wax poetic about ridiculous industry standards that are supposed to be interoperable and all this stuff, but why does not some standard description of content exists that all 28 platforms can read and interpret in their own ways. And I don't mean geometry translations and data migrations. I mean like, something like an XML data format where we describe what the piece is and then the software is building it themselves. Like I question why
Yeah.
I can spend weeks building content that people need because there isn't an automated way to do it yet. And I think those are the kind of issues that came out last year, which were a lot of fun to talk about.
Yeah, and we talked earlier about that event. We intentionally said from the get-go that it wasn't going to be about standards
That's right.
per se,
That's right.
because the old saying that if you get 12 people that represent 12 standards in a room, you come out with a 13th.
That's right.
So it's kind of an unconference from a standards standpoint. Even though this year we are going to have a panel at the end of the second day talking about what the kind of state of standards are and what's going on there, and getting some feedback from everybody. But this one of the things that we've talked about with the BCS event is, because we do have lots of manufacturers, there are things that, rather than another standards committee getting together, sometimes it just takes leadership. What I'll say is, like, it just takes a couple of different parties who maybe have enough influence or weight to come together to say, this is what we've decided it should be. And you'd be amazed at how much influence that can have, and other people will just start to adopt it and,
Sure.
and do those types of things. So I know one of the talks that's going to be this year is Kevin Kochman from KCL. He's done a great job in the restaurant side, equipment side of the business, and he basically kind of got all the restaurant equipment manufacturers to standardize and adopt that. And it's one of the areas of content that people have raved about, like, how come they were able to do this really well. So Kevin's actually going to come and talk about the value of clustering, what's the value of getting people together like this and getting them to standardize, because it just
Absolutely.
benefits everybody if you can make that happen.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of talk about this year's event. Do you want to talk a little bit about that we did decide to pull the trigger and expand this thing to Europe?
Yeah, that would be great. So last year was our first BCS event. Not only was it the first year, but the announcements that the event was happening came a bit later than we anticipated, which didn't give attendees a lot of reaction time to make it to the event. And we still managed to get to the 100 people that we wanted at the event. And so there was a lot of fantastic feedback from the event. Everybody thought there was a lot of great discussions there. And we got some good feedback about, some different types of structure to the event and what kind of sessions we could have. And so a couple things changed for this year. One is what you mentioned earlier. It's now a 2-day event. And it's a 2-day event with some really interesting spaces. And I want to talk about this briefly before we get to the Europe event. But one of the things that's changing this year is, last year we were all in one room all the time together, even though we were broken out into different work sessions and whatnot. But this year we had enough structure of, we'd like to talk about this and talk about this, that this year there will be a couple of different rooms of activities going on at any given time. There will be somebody's perspective, which is what we talked about, where there is a point of view about problems or issues related to content from their field in the market sector. So that, like I said, they may work for FM, and they may be talking about what troubles they have with compiling data from all the different manufacturers. But there'll also be what we call synapse sessions going on at the same time. So if the perspective that's being lectured about isn't relevant to you, you can jump into a synapse session where people will be doing some deep dives, showing off maybe some issues they have or some solutions they've come up with. And, it's not going to be marketing presentations like, well, check out what I can do with content, but it's going to be real kind of, how do we get around this issue? And there's also going to be what we call the engine room, which is probably the part that I'm the most excited about. And that is, it's going to be an area with experts on hand to work through content issues or discuss content issues at any point in time. So, it happens at every event that you go to. You're in a class and, you interpreted that they were going to be speaking about one thing and it's slightly different, and suddenly you don't feel like it's very relevant to you, so you pop out of the back. Well, you can pop out of the back, go to this engine room, break out some content and say, hey, I got this from a manufacturer. What do you think about it? Or if you are the manufacturer, you can be like, check this out. I think it's awesome. And, somebody will be there to be like, no, it's not. Or
Right.
it could be if you do this. Have you thought about doing this? But one of the other changes, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, I'm rambling, but was that a lot of the feedback that we got last year was, man, BCS sounds great, but I'm not attending the North American RTC because I live in Europe or I live in this other country. And so we did do some studies, and we are expanding BCS to the RTC Europe conference this year. So in October, there will be a one-day BCS event in Porto, Portugal.
Yes, Porto, Portugal. So if you haven't been to Portugal and you want to go, this is a great event. So we're going to basically duplicate last year's kind of inaugural event format for this year in Europe. It's kind of a kickoff, and then as it follows the event in time of year that we are doing the North American event, we can kind of learn from what's worked or not worked during this. So, as you said, we've expanded to this 2-day, and I think it's worth saying that the kind of goal for the BCS event has been not to make it's not a place where you come and learn how to I'll say hands-on do things or use software. It's much more of a kind of strategic thinking. So we're trying to get the people within the firms that understand the real issues, that have influence within there, and for them to bring their knowledge and expertise and help the manufacturers and the software service providers understand what those issues are. So the idea is to put those kinds of people who have the ability to understand that, think about it in a very strategic way, and then ultimately go home and help to influence and improve, what's going on in the market. So, but that being said, the engine room that we're adding this year is a little more tactical, I think, kind of piece to this, which is, you can come. We're actually going to have that staffed with experts that have lots of knowledge around the specific tools and the ways of kind of creating this stuff. So it's a way for people to actually not only come and talk about this stuff, but if they've got specific issues or things, they can actually bring it, roll up their sleeves, and try to get some things done. So
yeah, and I know everybody is generally, depending on the circles you run in, not every firm is okay with necessarily sharing, but I kind of recommend people for this year with the engine room to, if you have some content that's been a problem or people don't think it's very elegant or it doesn't work very well, throw that stuff on a flash drive before you come to BCS. I joke around. I mean, I'll have a small setup in the engine room where I'll be working on content with people, and obviously I'll have all of my content there. But I tell people, if you've got a window that doesn't work or if you've got a piece of equipment that's too clunky, bring that stuff with you on a flash drive and let's tear it apart in front of everybody and see what we can come up with. I've actually done a few of those. At another conference that shall not be named, last year, a bunch of us were hanging out in the Autodesk support booth with laptops, and we were tearing apart content, and some great things happened just hanging out there. So definitely pack up some content, as long as it's content you have permission to be bringing with you to get help with and stuff.
So how if somebody's interested in this, where should we direct them to go so they can learn more?
They can go to the BCS website, which is buildconsum.com. If I had a better marker, I'd write that down and put it on the screen. We do it in post.
Buildconsum, and I think there was some problems with the schedule showing up on that version.
Yes.
So the other way to get to it is go to rtcevents.com, rtcevents.com, and you'll see BCS as one of the events listed, and you can click there, and it'll kind of get you to the same info.
Yes, absolutely. That was my fault. I need to fix the schedule on the other page.
Yeah. So we'll get that squared away. The other thing, we'll kind of wrap this episode 1006, 106, 101, whatever episode we want to call this.
1606.
But Aaron and I started talking about, look, there's plenty of kind of deep knowledge and interest in a lot of people that it would be fun to do exactly what we're doing. I would say it puts us in a very special class. I'm not going to say what people would call us being in this. If you get your kicks out of 30 minutes of deep talk about building, information modeling, and content and these types of things, but we decided, Aaron and I, after we started talking about this, let's start a little podcast. And one of the things that's great about the BCS event is it uncovers all kinds of great experts and, people I had never met, heard their names but hadn't been around them. So I'm sure that as we continue to do this podcast, we'll start bringing in guests like that.
Absolutely.
And so it should be a lot of fun. Maybe between now and the BCS event in Phoenix, we can actually do a couple more of these and try to pull some of the speakers that we have lined up to come and at least spend a few minutes to talk. The other thing I was going to say is that we are planning to actually be set up at the BCS event and actually do some of these interviews on camera while we're there as well. So they'll probably be 5, 10, 15-minute kind of conversations as we can pull people aside while they're there at the event to talk about these types of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we need some kind of a sign off or something. I don't know what.
I joked, no.
Yeah. I joked around with Aaron the other day that we're going to have a swear jar. We'll have to figure out, what we're comfortable with, how we're going to, kind of run this thing as we move forward.
Yeah.
But
well, I guess I would say, yeah. I mean, I think the podcast is going to be a lot of fun. I mean, today we really wanted to focus on the Building Content Summit, and I would say kind of the same things that we said about BCS. I think there could be a lot of great conversations here. We could have some manufacturers, we could have some people who use content or abuse content. I think it doesn't need to be, trying to run parallel to YouTube videos explaining how to build specific pieces of content. That would be kind of a drag. So I think we could have a lot of great conversations here, and I'm looking forward to what we do in the future.
Yep, good. Well, we got our first little mini equipment together. I bought a new microphone to be able to do these, so we're starting to act professional. So we'll see how it goes. But
a little bit.
Anyway, this is fun. I joked with you. It's like we both have the gift of gab. I call it myself. It's like we never have any trouble having an opinion and or being willing to talk about it.
Absolutely.
So hopefully we'll have some good conversations moving forward.
Definitely will. And so I think number 1606 is wrapped.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, Aaron.
Yep.